The Greek author of the allegorical tablet of Cebes gives expression to this admirable conclusion. There is one only real good to be desired, and this is wisdom. There is but one evil to fear, and it is madness. Moral evil, wickedness and crime are indeed and literally mania. Father Hilarion Tiso has therefore our heartfelt sympathy when he proclaims without ceasing in his extravagantly daring pamphlets that in place of punishing criminals we must take them under our charge and cure them. But, sympathy notwithstanding, reason rises in protest against excessively charitable interpretations of crime, the consequence of which would be to destroy the sanction of morality by disarming law. We liken mania to intoxication, and seeing that the latter is nearly always voluntary, we applaud the wisdom of judges who punish the misdemeanors and crimes committed in the state of drunkenness, not regarding the voluntary loss of reason as an excuse. There may come even a day when the self-induced condition will be counted as an aggravating circumstance, and when the intelligent being who by his own act sets himself outside reason will find that he is also outside the pale of law. Is not law the reason of humanity? Woe to him who gets drunk, whether with wine, pride, hatred, or even love. He becomes blind, unjust, the sport of circumstance. He is a walking scourge and living fatality. He may slay or violate. He is an unchained fool, and let him be denounced as such. Society has the right of self-defense. It is more than a right, it is duty, for society has children. These reflections are prompted by the magical prosecutions of which we have to give some account. The Church and society have been too often charged with the judicial murder of fools. We admit that the sorcerers were fools, but theirs was the folly of perversity. If some innocent but diseased persons have perished among them, these things are misfortunes for which neither society nor the Church can be held responsible. Every man who is condemned according to the laws of his country and the judicial forms of his time is condemned justly, his possible innocence being henceforth in the hands of God. Before men he is and must remain guilty. In a remarkable romance, called The Sorceress's Sabbath, Ludwig Tieck depicts a holy woman, a poor old creature outworn by macerations, mentally enfeebled by fasts and prayers, who, being full of horror at sorcerers, yet disposed by excessive humility to accuse herself of all crimes, ends in believing that she is a witch, confesses it, is convicted by error and prejudgment, and finally is burnt alive. What would such a history prove, supposing that it were true? Neither more nor less than the possibility of a judicial blunder. But if such mistakes are possible in fact, they cannot be so in equity, or what would become of human justice? Socrates condemned to death might have had recourse to flight and his own judges would have furnished the means, but he respected the laws and resolved therefore to die. The severity of certain sentences must be blamed to the laws and not the tribunals of the Middle Ages. Was Gilles de Laval, whose crimes and their punishment have been narrated, condemned unjustly, and must he be absolved as a fool? Were those horrible imbeciles innocent who composed philters from the fat of little children? Moreover, black magic was the general mania of this unfortunate epoch. By their incessant application to questions of sorcery, the very judges occasionally ended by thinking that they also had committed the same crimes. The plague became epidemic in many localities and executions seemed to multiply the guilty. Demonographers like Delancourt, Delrio, Sprenger, Bodin, and Torreblanca give reports of many prosecutions, the details of which are equally tedious and revolting. The condemned creatures were mostly hallucinated and idiotic, but they were wicked in their idiocy and dangerous in their hallucination. Erotic passion, greed and hatred were the chief causes which brought about disorder in their reason. They were indeed capable of anything. Sprenger says that sorceresses were in league with midwives to secure dead bodies of newborn children. The midwives killed these innocents at the very moment of their birth, driving long needles into the brain. The babe was said to have been stillborn and was buried as such. On the night following, the Striges dug up the ground and removed the corpse, which they stewed in a pan with narcotic and poisonous herbs, afterwards distilling this human gelatin. The liquor did duty as an elixir of long life, and the solid part, pounded and incorporated with soot and the grease of a black cat, was used for magical rubbing. The stomach turns with loathing at such abominable revelations, and pity is silenced by anger. But when one refers to the trials themselves, sees the credulity and cruelty of judges, the lying promises of mercy employed to extract admissions, the atrocious tortures, obscene examinations, shameful and ridiculous precautions, and finally the public execution, with the derisive ministrations of a priesthood which surrendered to the secular arm and asked mercy on those whom it had just condemned to death. Amidst all this chaos one is forced to conclude that religion alone rests holy, but that human beings are all and equally either idiots or scoundrels. In the year 1598 a priest of Limousin, named Pierre Apetit, was burned alive for ridiculous confessions extracted from him by torture. In 1599 a woman named Antide Collas was burned at Dole because there was something abnormal in her sexual conformation, and it was regarded as explicable only by a shameful intercourse with Satan. Repeatedly put to the torture, stripped, scrutinized by doctors and judges, overwhelmed with shame and suffering, the unfortunate being confessed everything that she might somehow end it all. Henri Boguet, judge of St. Claude, relates how he caused a woman to be tortured as a sorceress because there was a piece missing from the cross of her rosary, and it was a certain sign of witchcraft in the view of this ferocious maniac. A child of 12 years, brought up by the inquisitors, accused his own father of taking him to the Sabbath. The father died in prison as the result of his sufferings, and it was proposed to burn the boy, which was opposed by Boguet, who made a virtue of the clemency. Roland de Verneuil, 35 years old, was imprisoned in such a freezing dungeon that she promised to admit herself guilty of magic if she might be allowed to go near a fire. As soon as she felt its warmth she fell into frightful convulsions, accompanied by fever and delirium. In this condition she was put to the torture, made every required statement, and was dragged in a dying condition to the stake. A storm broke out, extinguished the fire, and thereupon Boguet gloated over the sentence which he had pronounced, since she who in appearance was thus protected by heaven must really and incontestably be aided by the devil. This same judge burnt Pierre Gaudelin and Pierre Legros for travelling by night, the one in the form of a hare and the other in that of a wolf. But the prosecution which caused the greatest stir at the beginning of the 17th century was that of Messire Louis Gaufridi, curé of the parish of Écoules, at Marseille. The scandal of this affair created a fatal precedent, which was only followed too faithfully. It was a case of priests accusing a priest, of a minister dragged before a tribunal of his associates in the ministry. Constantine had said that if he found a priest dishonoring his calling by some shameful sin he would cover him with his own purple, which was a beautiful and royal saying, for the priesthood ought to be stainless, even as justice is infallible in the presence of public morality. In December 1610 a young woman of Marseille went on a pilgrimage to Saint-Baume in Provence, and there fell into ecstasy and convulsions. She was named Magdalene de la Palude. Louise Capot, another devotee, was similarly seized some short time after. The Dominicans and Capuchins believed that it was possession by the devil and had recourse to exorcisms. The result was that Magdalene de la Palude and her fellow victim presented that spectacle which was renewed so often a century later during the epidemic of convulsions. They screamed, writhed, begged to be beaten and trampled underfoot. One day 6 men walked successively over the breast of Magdalene without the slightest suffering on her part. While in this state she made confession of the most extraordinary licentiousness, saying that she had given herself, body and soul, to the devil, to whom she had been affianced by a priest named Gaufridi. So far from incarcerating the distracted girl, she obtained a hearing, and the exorcising monks dispatched 3 Capuchins to Marseille for the purpose of secretly acquainting the ecclesiastical superiors with the state of affairs at Saint-Baume, the object, if possible, being to bring the curé Gaufridi thither and confront him with the supposed demons. Furthermore, the monks put on record the infernal inspirations of the 2 hysterics, which were discourses full of ignorant and fanatical devotion, presenting religion as this was understood by the exorcists themselves. In a word, the possessed women seemed to be relating the dreams of those who exorcised them. It was precisely the phenomena of table rapping and mediums in our own days. The devils assumed names not less incongruous than those of the spirits in America. They declaimed against printing and books, delivering sermons worthy of the most fervent and illiterate Capuchins. In the presence of demons made in their own image and their own likeness, the fathers were confirmed in the fact of the possession and in the veracity of the infernal spirits. The phantoms of their diseased imaginations assumed bodily shape and living manifestation in the 2 women, whose obscene admissions at once stimulated their curiosity and their indignation, full of secret lust. Such were their dispositions when the unhappy Louis Gaufridi was at length brought before them. Gaufridi was an all too worldly priest, of agreeable countenance, weak character and more than dubious morality. He had been the confessor of Magdalene de la Palude and had inspired her with an insatiable passion, which, being changed by jealousy into hatred, became a fatality and drew the unfortunate priest into its whirlpool of madness, by which he was carried ultimately to the stake. Whatsoever was said by the accused in his own defense was turned against him. He called on God and Christ Jesus, on the Blessed Mother of Christ and the precursor Saint John Baptist. But they answered, "You are excellent at reciting the litanies of the Sabbath. By God, you understand Lucifer. By Jesus Christ, Beelzebub. By the Holy Virgin, the apostate mother of Antichrist. By Saint John Baptist, the false prophet and precursor of Gog and Magog." Gaufridi was put to the torture and promised mercy if he would sign the declarations of Magdalene de la Palude. Distracted, circumvented, broken, the poor priest signed whatever was required. It was sufficient for his burning, and this was the object in view. This also was the frightful spectacle which the Provençal Capuchins gave to the people as a lesson in violating the privileges of the sanctuary. They showed how priests are killed, and the people remembered later on. A rabbi who witnessed the prodigies which went before the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus exclaimed, "O holy temple! What is it that possesses thee, and why frighten thyself in this manner?" Neither chair of Peter nor bishops protested against the murder of Gaufridi, but the 18th century was to come, bringing the revolution in its wake. One of the possessed women who had destroyed the curé of Écoules testified that the demon was leaving her to prepare the murder of another priest, whom she named prophetically in advance and in the absence of all personal knowledge. This was Urbain Grandier. It was then the reign of that terrible Cardinal de Richelieu, for whom absolute authority alone could guarantee the salvation of states. Unfortunately, his tendencies were political and subtle rather than truly Christian. One limitation which characterized this great man was a certain narrowness of heart, which made him sensible to personal offense and also implacable in revenge. And further, that which he was least ready to pardon in talent was independence. While he preferred men of parts for auxiliaries rather than flatterers, he took a certain pleasure in destroying whatsoever desired to shine apart from him. His ambition was to dominate all. Father Joseph was his right hand and Laubardemont his left. There was then in the provinces, at Loudun, an ecclesiastic of remarkable genius and exalted character, possessed also of learning and talent but lacking in circumspection. Made to please multitudes and attract the sympathies of the great, he might on occasion have become a dangerous partisan. Protestantism was at that period bestirring in France, and the curé of St. Peter's at Loudun, predisposed to the new ideas by his dislike of ecclesiastical celibacy, might prove at the head of such a party a preacher more brilliant than Calvin and not less daring than Luther. He was named Urbain Grandier. Serious differences with his bishop had already given instances of his ability and his inflexible character, but by mischance it was maladroit ability, since from enemies who were powerful he had appealed to the king and not, unhappily, to the cardinal. The king held that he was right, but it remained for the cardinal to teach him how far he was wrong. Grandier meanwhile had gone back in triumph to Loudun, and had indulged in the unclerical display of entering the town bearing a branch of laurel. From that time he was lost. The Lady Superior of the Ursuline nuns at Loudun was named Mother Jeanne des Anges in religion, otherwise, Jeanne de Belfiel, granddaughter of the Baron de Cos. She could not be termed fervent in piety, and her convent was not to be ranked among the strictest in the country. In particular, nocturnal scenes took place which were attributed to spirits. Relatives withdrew boarders, and the house was on the point of being denuded of all resources. Grandier was responsible for certain intrigues and was a little careless regarding them, while he was much too public a character for the idleness of a small town not to make a noise over his shortcomings. The pupils of the Ursulines heard them discussed mysteriously by their parents. The nuns spoke of them, deploring the scandal and dwelling over much upon him through whom it arose. Of that which they talked by day they dreamed by night. And so it came about that at night they saw him appear in their dormitories under circumstances which were conformable with his alleged morals. They uttered cries, believed themselves obsessed, and in this manner the devil was let loose among them. The directors of the nuns, who were mortal enemies of Grandier, did not fail to perceive the advantage they could draw from the affair in the interests of their rancor and in those of the convent. They began to perform exorcisms, at first privately and afterwards in public. The friends of Grandier felt that there was a plot hatching, and were anxious that he should exchange his benefice, in order to leave Loudun, believing that everything would quiet down when he was gone. But Grandier was brave and could not tolerate yielding to calumny. He remained therefore and was arrested one morning as he entered his church, clothed in sacerdotal vestments. He was treated forthwith as a state prisoner. His papers were seized, seals were placed on his effects, and he was conducted, under a strong guard, to the fortress at Angers. Meanwhile a dungeon was prepared for him at Loudun which seemed intended for a wild beast rather than a man. Richelieu, informed of everything, had dispatched Laubardemont to make an end of Grandier and forbade the Parliament to take cognizance of the affair. If the conduct of the curé of Saint-Pierre had been that of a worldling, the demeanour of Grandier, a prisoner on a charge of magic, was that of a hero and a martyr. So does adversity reveal great souls, and it is much easier to withstand suffering than prosperity. He wrote to his mother, "I bear my affliction with patience and pity yours more than my own. I am very unwell, having no bed. Try to have mine brought me, for if the body does not rest the mind gives way. Send me also my breviary, a Bible, and St. Thomas for my consolation. For the rest, do not grieve. I hope that God will vindicate my innocence. There is no question that God does sooner or later take the part of persecuted innocence, but he does not invariably deliver it from enemies on earth, save indeed by death." This lesson was about to be learned by Grandier. On our own part, do not let us represent men worse than they are in fact. His enemies did not believe in his innocence. They pursued him with fury, but he whom they pursued was for them a great criminal. The phenomena of hysteria were little understood at the time, and somnambulism was quite unknown. The convulsions of nuns, their bodily motions exceeding all normal human power, their astonishing evidences of second sight were things of a nature to convince the least credulous. A well-known atheist of the day, being the Sieur de Carriolais, councillor in the Parliament of Brittany, came to witness the exorcisms and to deride them. The nuns, who had never seen him, addressed him by name and published sins which he supposed to be unknown to anyone. He was so overwhelmed that he passed from one extreme to another, like all hot-headed natures. He shed tears, made his confession and dedicated his remaining days to the strictest asceticism. The sophistry of the exorcists of Loudun was that absurd unreason which M. de Merville has the courage to sustain at the present day. The devil is the author of all phenomena which cannot be explained by known laws of nature. To this illogical maxim they joined another which was, so to speak, an article of faith. The devil who has been duly exorcised is compelled to speak the truth and can therefore be admitted as a witness in the cause of justice. The unfortunate Grandier was not therefore delivered into the hands of malefactors but rather of raving maniacs, who, strong in their rectitude of conscience, gave the fullest publicity to this incredible prosecution. Such a scandal had never afflicted the Church. Howling, writhing nuns, making the most obscene gestures, blaspheming, striving to cast themselves on Grandier like the Bacchants on Orpheus, the most sacred things of religion mixed up with this hideous spectacle and drawn in the filth thereof. Amidst all Grandier alone calm, shrugging his shoulders and defending himself with dignity and mildness. In fine, pallid, distraught judges, sweating profusely, and Laubardemont in his red robe, hovering over the conflict, like a vulture awaiting a corpse. Such was the prosecution of Urbain Grandier. Let us say for the honor of humanity that one is compelled to assume good faith in exorcists and judges alike, for such a conspiracy as would be involved in the legal murder of the accused is happily impossible. Monsters are as uncommon as heroes. The mass is composed of mediocrities, equally incapable of great virtues and great crimes. The holiest persons of the day believed in the possession at Loudun. Even Saint Vincent de Paul was not unacquainted with its history and was asked to give his opinion about it. Richelieu himself, though he might in any case have found some way of getting rid of Grandier, ended by believing him guilty. His death was the crime arising from the ignorance and prejudice of the period. It was a catastrophe rather than a murder. We spare our readers the details of his tortures. He remained firm, resigned, patient, although confessing nothing. He did not even affect to despise his judges but prayed mildly for the exorcists to spare him. "And you, my fathers," he said to them, "abate the rigor of my torments, and reduce not my soul to despair." Through this moan of complaining nature, one discerns all the meekness of the Christian who forgives. To hide their emotion, the exorcists replied with invectives, and the executioners wept. 3 nuns, in one of their lucid moments, cast themselves before the tribunal, crying that Grandier was innocent. But it was believed that the devil was speaking by their mouth, and their declaration only hastened the end. Urbain Grandier was burnt alive on August 18, 1634. He was patient and resigned to the end. When he was taken from the cart, His legs being broken, he fell heavily face down on the earth without uttering a single cry or groan. A Franciscan, named Father Grillau, squeezed through the crowd and raised up the sufferer, whom he embraced weeping. "I bring you," said he, "the blessing of your mother. She and I pray God for you." "Thank you, my father," answered Grandier. "You alone pity me. Console my poor mother and be a son unto her." The provost's lieutenant, deeply affected, then said to him, "Sir, forgive me the part one am compelled to take in your anguish." And Grandier answered, "You have not offended me and are obliged to fulfill the duties committed to your charge." They had promised to strangle him before the burning, but when the executioner sought to tighten the rope it proved to be knotted, and the unfortunate Curé de Saint-Pierre fell alive into the flames. The chief exorcists, Fathers Tranquille and Lactance, died soon after in the delirium of violent frenzy. Father Surin, who succeeded them, became imbecile. Minori, the surgeon who assisted at the torturing of Grandier, died haunted by the phantom of his victim. Laubardemont lost his son in a tragical manner and fell into disgrace with his master. The nuns remained idiots. So is it true that the question was one of a terrible and contagious malady, the mental disease of false zeal and false devotion. Providence punishes people by their own faults and instructs them by the sad consequences of their errors. 10 years after the death of Grandier, the Loudun scandals were renewed in Normandy, where the nuns of Louviers accused 2 priests of having bewitched them. Of these priests, one was already dead, but they violated the sanctity of the tomb to disinter his corpse. The details of the possession were identical with those of Loudun and Saint Baume. The hysterical women translated into foul language the nightmares of their directors. Both priests were condemned to the flames, and, to increase the horror, a living man and a corpse were bound to the same stake. The punishment of Mezentius, that fiction of a pagan poet, came so to be realized by Christians. A Christian people assisted coldly at the sacrilegious execution, and the ministers did not realize that in thus profaning at once the priestly office and the dead, they gave a frightful precedent to impiety. When the call came, the 18th century arrived to extinguish the fires with the blood of priests, and, as it happens almost invariably, the good paid for the wicked. At the beginning of that century the burning of human beings still proceeded. Though faith was dead, hypocrisy abandoned the youthful Labarre to the most horrible tortures because he refused to uncover when a procession went by. Voltaire was then in evidence and conscious in his heart of a vocation like that of Attila. While human passions were profaning religion, God sent this new destroyer to remove religion from a world which was no longer worthy of it. In 1731, a young woman of Toulon, named Catherine Cadière, accused her confessor, the Jesuit Girard, of seduction and magic. She was a stigmatized ecstatic who had long passed as a saint. Her history is one of lascivious swoons, secret flagellations and lewd sensations. Where is the sink of infamy with mysteries comparable to those of celibate imagination disordered by dangerous mysticism? The woman was not believed on her mere word and Father Girard escaped condemnation. The scandal for this reason was not less great, but the noise which it made was echoed by a burst of laughter. We have said that Voltaire was among us. Superstitious people till then had explained extraordinary phenomena by the intervention of the devil and of spirits. Equally absurd on its own part, the school of Voltaire, in the face of all evidence, denied the phenomena themselves. It was said by the one side that whatsoever we cannot explain comes from the devil. The answer on the other side was, that the things which we cannot explain do not exist. By reproducing under analogous circumstances the same series of eccentric and wonderful facts, nature protested in the one case against presumptuous ignorance and in the other against efficient science. Physical disturbances have, in all times, accompanied certain nervous maladies. Fools, epileptics, cataleptics, victims of hysteria have exceptional faculties, are subject to infectious hallucinations and produce occasionally, in the atmosphere or in surrounding objects, certain commotions and derangements. He who is hallucinated exteriorizes his dreams and is tormented by his own shadow. The body is surrounded with its own reflections, distorted by the sufferings of the brain. The subject beholds his own image in the astral light. The powerful currents of that light, acting like a magnet, displace and overturn furniture. Noises are then heard and voices sound as in dreams. These phenomena, so often repeated at this day that they have become vulgar, were attributed by our fathers to phantoms and demons. Voltairean philosophy found it more easy to deny them, treating the ocular witnesses of the most incontestable facts as so many imbeciles and idiots. What, for example, is better accredited than the extraordinary convulsions at the grave of Paris the Deacon, or at the meetings of St. Médard ecstatics? What is the explanation of the strange buffetings demanded by the convulsionaries? Blows rained by thousands on the head, compressions which would have crushed a hippopotamus, torsions of breasts with iron pincers, even crucifixion with nails driven into hands and feet. And then the superhuman contortions and levitations? The followers of Voltaire refused to see anything but sport and frolic therein. The Jansenists cried miracle. The true Catholics sighed. Science, which should have intervened, and that only, to explain the fantastic disease, held aloof. It is to her nevertheless that there now belong the Ursulines of Loudun, the nuns of Louviers, the convulsionaries and the American mediums. The phenomena of magnetism have placed science on the path of new discoveries, and the coming chemical synthesis will lead our physicians to a knowledge of the astral light. When this universal force is once known, what will prevent them from determining the strength, number and direction of its magnets? A revolution will follow in science, and there will be a return to the transcendental magic of Chaldea. Much has been talked about the presbytery of Sideville. De Merville, Gougenot Desmaceau and other uncritical believers have seen in the strange occurrences which took place therein a contemporary revelation of the devil. But the same things happened at St. Maur in 1706, and thither all Paris flocked. There were great rappings on walls, beds rocked without being touched, other furniture was displaced. The manifestations finished in a climax during which the master of the house, a young man of 24 or 25 years old, and a person of weak constitution, fell into a deep swoon and believed that he heard spirits speaking to him at great length, though he could never repeat subsequently a single word that they said. One history of an apparition at the beginning of the 18th century may here follow. The simplicity of the account proves its authenticity. There are certain characteristics of truth which cannot be simulated by inventors. A pious priest of Valognes, named Beswell, was invited to dinner on January 7, 1708 by a lady related to the Abbé de Saint-Pierre, the abbé being also of the company, and the priest recounted, at their request, the appearance of one of his deceased comrades in open day, some 12 years previously. In 1695, he told them that he was a young scholar, about 15 years old, and that he was acquainted with two lads, sons of Aubakine, a solicitor, who were scholars like himself. The elder was my own age and the other, who was some 18 months younger, was named Desfontaines. We walked together and shared our amusements, and whether or not Desfontaines had greater friendship for me, or was more lively, more affable, more intelligent than his brother, I know that I cared for him more. We were wandering in the cloister of the Capucines, in 1696, when he told me that he had been reading a story of two friends who had promised one another that whichever of them died first should bring news of his condition to him who survived. That one of them who did pass away redeemed his pledge and told the survivor astonishing things. Desfontaines then said that he had a favour to ask me, which was to make a similar promise, he doing likewise on his own part. I was, however, unwilling and indeed declined the proposal. Several months passed away, during which he recurred frequently to the idea, I always resisting. About August, 1696, when he was on the point of leaving to continue his studies at Caen, he pressed me so much, and with tears in his eyes, that at length I consented. He produced thereupon two little slips of paper on which he had written beforehand, one signed with his blood and in which he promised me, in the event of his death, to give me news of his state, the other in which I entered into a similar bond. I pricked my finger, and with the blood which issued therefrom I signed my own name. He was delighted to receive the promise and embraced me with 1,000 thanks. Some time after he left, accompanied by his brother. The separation was grievous to both of us. We wrote from time to time, and then there was a silence for the space of 6 weeks, after which the event happened that I am about to relate. On July 31, 1697, being a Thursday and a day which I shall always remember, the late M. de Sortoval, with whom I lodged and who was always exceedingly good to me, begged me to go into a meadow adjoining the Franciscan monastery and help his people in haymaking. I had not been there for more than a quarter of an hour when, about 2:30, I suddenly felt giddy and overcome with weakness. It was to no purpose that I tried to lean on my hay fork. I felt obliged to lie down on the hay and so remained for about half an hour, trying to recover my strength. The feeling passed away but, having never had such an experience previously, it caused me some surprise, and I feared that it was the beginning of an illness. I have no special recollection regarding the remainder of the day, but on the following night I slept less than usual. At the same hour next day, as I was walking in the meadow with M. de Saint-Simon, grandson of M. de Sortoval, then about 10 years old, I was overcome in exactly the same way and sat down in the shade on a stone. It passed again and we continued our walk. Nothing further occurred on that day, and the next night I slept scarcely at all. Finally, on the morrow, being the 2nd day of August, I was in the loft where they stacked the hay at precisely the same hour, when I was again seized with a similar giddiness and weakness, but more serious than before. I swooned and lost all consciousness. One of the servants saw me and asked what was the matter, to which it is said that I replied, stating that I had seen what I should have never believed. I do not however recollect either the question or answer. The memory which does remain with me is that I had seen someone in a state of nakedness to the waist, but it was not anyone whom I recognized. I was helped down the ladder. I held tight to the rungs. But when I saw Desfontaines, my comrade, at the foot of the ladder, the weakness returned. My head fell between two of the rungs and again I lost consciousness. I was laid upon a wide beam which served for a bench on the Grande Place des Capucines. I saw nothing of M. de Sortoval nor of his servants, though they were present, but I observed Desfontaines, still by the foot of the ladder, signaling for me to come to him, and I drew back on my seat as if to make room for him. Those who were by me and whom I did not see, though my eyes were open, observed this movement. He did not respond and I rose to go towards him. He then came forward and taking my left arm in his own right arm, he led me some paces forward into a quiet street, with arms still interlocked. The servants, thinking that my giddiness had passed and that I was going about some business of my own, went back to their work, with the exception of one youth, who told M. de Sortoval that I was talking to myself. He came up to me and heard me questioning and answering, as he has since told me. I was there for nearly 3/4 of an hour, talking to Desfontaines, who said, "I promised that if I died before you I would come and tell you. I was drowned the day before yesterday in the river at Caen. It was just about this time, and I was walking with some friends. It was exceedingly warm, we decided to bathe, a weakness came over me and I sank to the bottom. My companion, the Abbé de Ménil-Jean, dived to bring me up. I caught hold of his leg and as I clung very tight he may have thought that it was a salmon or he may have had to come up quickly, but he struck out so roughly with his leg that I received a blow upon the chest, throwing me again to the bottom, where the depth is considerable at that point." Desfontaines subsequently told me all that had happened in their walk and the subjects discussed between them. I was anxious to learn whether he was saved, whether he was damned, whether he was in purgatory, whether I was myself in a state of grace and whether I should follow him speedily. But he continued speaking as if he had not heard, or refused to listen. I tried to embrace him several times, but I seemed to embrace nothing. Yet I felt him still holding me tight by the arm, and when I attempted to turn away my head, so as not to see him because of the grief which it caused me, he tightened his grasp as if to compel me to look as well as to listen. He seemed taller than when I had last seen him and taller even than he was at the time of death, though he had grown a good deal during the 18 months since we met. I saw him as far as his waist only and he was naked, his head bare and a white paper twisted in his beautiful fair hair over the forehead. The paper had writing on it, but I could read only the word, in, and see. His voice was the same voice. He seemed neither gay nor sad, but in a calm and tranquil state. He begged me on his brother's return to give him certain messages for his father and mother. He begged me also to say the 7 penitential psalms, which had been imposed on him as a penance the previous Sunday and which he had not yet recited. Finally, he again advised me to speak to his brother and then bade me farewell, saying as he went, "Till I see you again," which was our usual formula when we parted at the end of a walk. He told me also that at the time he was drowned his brother, who was making a translation, regretted having let him go apart from him, in case of an accident. He described so well where he was drowned and the tree in the Avenue de Louvigny on which he had cut some words that 2 years afterwards, when in the company of the late Chevalier de Godot, one who was with him at the time, I pointed out the very spot and counting the trees on one side, as Desfontaines had specified, I went straight to the tree, there to find the inscription. I learned also that it was true about the 7 psalms which had been given him as a penance at confession. His brother also told me that he was writing his translation and reproached himself for not being with him. As a month went by before I was able to do as Desfontaines asked me in regard to his brother, he appeared to me on 2 other occasions before dinner in a country house a few miles away, to which I had been invited. Feeling unwell, I made an excuse of being tired, saying that it was nothing and that I should return. I went into a corner of the garden and Desfontaines reproached me for not having spoken to his brother. He talked to me for a quarter of an hour, but would not answer questions on my own part. The second appearance was in the morning, as I was going to Notre Dame de la Victoire, but the apparition was for a shorter time. He impressed on me about speaking to his brother and left me repeating, "Till I see you again," still without answering my questions. One remarkable fact is that I always had a pain in the arm where he had taken a hold of me the first time, and it remained till I had spoken to his brother. For 3 days I had no sleep owing to the astonishment in which I was. After the first conversation I told M. de Varenville, my schoolfellow and neighbour, that Desfontaines had been drowned, that he had appeared to me and told me so. He hurried to his relations, asking whether this was true. They had just had news on the subject but, owing to a misunderstanding, believed that it was the elder boy. He assured me that he had seen the letter of Desfontaines and he thought that this was correct. I maintained that it must be wrong, for Desfontaines himself had appeared to me. He went again to his relatives and returned in tears saying, "It is only too true. Nothing has happened to me since, and such was my experience simply. It has been told in many ways, but I have never related it otherwise than as I do now." The late Chevalier de Godit stated that Desfontaines also appeared to M. de Méniljean, but I do not know him. He is 50 miles from here, near Argentan, and I can tell you no more. We should notice the characteristics of dream which prevail throughout in this vision of a man who is awake, but in a state of semi-asphyxiation produced by the emanations of the hay. The astral intoxication following congestion of the brain will be recognized. The somnambulistic condition which followed showed M. Beswell the last living reflection left by his friend in the astral light. He was naked and was visible down to the waist only, because the rest of his body was immersed in the water of the river. The supposed paper in his hair was probably a handkerchief used to confine his hair when bathing. Beswell had further a somnambulistic intuition of all that took place, and it seemed to him that he was learning it from the lips of his friend. The friend appeared neither sad nor gay, an indication of the impression made upon him by an image which was lifeless and consisting only of reminiscence and reflection. On the occasion of the first vision, M. Beswell, intoxicated by the scent of the hay, fell off the ladder and injured his arm. It seemed, with the logic of dreams, that his friend was grasping the arm, and when he came to himself, he still felt the pain, which is explained quite naturally by the hurt that he had received. For the rest, the conversation of the deceased person was simply retrospective. There was nothing about death or the other life, proving once more how impossible is the barrier which separates this world from the next. In the prophecy of Ezekiel, life is represented by wheels which turn within one another. The elementary forms are symbolized by 4 beasts, which ascend and descend with the wheel and pursue one another without ever overtaking, like the signs of the zodiac. The wheels of perpetual movement never return on themselves. Forms never go back to the stations which they have quitted. To return whence one has come, the entire circle must have been traversed in a progress always the same and yet always new. The conclusion is that whatsoever manifests to us in this life is a phenomenon which belongs to this life, and it is not given here below to our thought, to our imagination, or even to our hallucinations and our dreams, to overstep even for an instant the formidable barriers of death.